Okay. Good morning. I'm Brian Maguire. I'll be moderating this next panel this morning. Thank you all for joining us today. This second panel is about cyberspace and security for business. Our panelists today come from a range of different backgrounds. We're going to introduce them in just a second. And each of you will have the opportunity to pose some questions in just a few moments as well. We want to make this as informal as possible, so please don't hold back with your questions. Each of the speakers will begin just with a short introduction, 2-3 minutes, explain where they're from, what they want to pitch towards today as well. Then I'll bring some questions to them as everybody settles down a little bit, and then we'll open the floor to you just after that as well. And just to put this in context, last night I was filming a report on EU and NATO, and a big part of this, we were talking about cybersecurity. And not just in the context of hacking institutions, but about the impact on the single market, about how confidence in these markets works. So, in the context of how our geopolitics is working today, this is something which is becoming incredibly serious, that NATO itself is investing a huge amount of money in the future in cybersecurity as well. So today, while we're talking about business, we're also putting it against that background as well. So let me introduce our first speaker this morning, Emad Yaghmaei, Research Fellow at the Delft Institute of Technology, who also teaches in Denmark as well. Emad, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you want to speak about today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. Actually, I'm from Delft, Research Fellow at Delft, and the main work of us is working on social impact of emerging technologies, particularly cybersecurity. And actually being here at this panel, Cybersecurity for Business and Customers, it stresses me to the fact that cybersecurity is becoming, as we know, more important in a sense of societies and people are working and relying more on digital infrastructures. But it's also important, however, to point the fact and focus not only on security, the core value of cybersecurity, but also in other fundamental values in order to avoid burning the village while we are securing and saving it. So other fundamental values like autonomy, like privacy, fairness, freedom, needs to be maintained into the security while we are securing system. We are securing networks and data in cyberspace. And it needs to also be engaged with people, customers, and policymakers in order to reflect their interests, reflect their concerns. And I do believe that we can discuss about that, about working on common values between different stakeholders who are involved in cybersecurity helps us and is sorts of bridges between different stakeholders, including businesses and customers, and raise awareness among customers in the cybersecurity market, and help us to answer the question to cyberspace concerns, and so on and so forth. And I hope we can discuss about values, sorts of conflicts of values, and how we can bridge between different stakeholders in cyberspace.
Thank you. Our next speaker here also is Udo Helmbrecht, Executive Director of ENISA. Udo, what do you do?
I'm also a warm welcome from my side. It's a great pleasure to be here. So we have two main tasks. One is that we support the Commission and the Member States in implementing legislation. Maybe you know the EIDAS directive or the NIS directive. And the other task is that we look into technologies, business models, and the IT security aspects. So just to give you two examples, if you look from the technology side, and we heard a couple of topics already this morning, it's about big data, Internet of Things, sensors and actuators. We have cloud computing, mobile technology, Commissioner mentioned G5. We have natural user interfaces when you look about new kind of, let's say, virtual reality, and also about high-end computing. And just to give you a couple of examples, what we also deal with and make some, let's say, reports on this, maybe we can dig into this later also. If you look into ransomware, this is something where it went up by 175% if you look into our threat landscape. We have data breaches which increased from last year to this year by 20%. We had a couple of weeks, the first more than terabyte denial of service attacks by Internet of Things devices on the name server services DYN, which brought down in the end big retailers like Amazon or others, or Twitter, at least for a time, which was significant for the users. So this means cyberspace is a kind of the new battlefield. And if you look into the cybercrime capitalization, just to give you some figures, the market capitalization of Apple is $650 billion, and the next one is X and Microsoft with nearly $400 billion. And cybercrime is estimated in between with $450 billion. So it's between the first and the second of the market capitalization, which means that there is a lot of money earned in this business in a negative sense.
So if you want to get into cybercrime, it's the way forward for your career. Okay, our next speaker today is Vincent Steckler, global CEO of Avast. He had the longest commute, and I think is still suffering a little bit from that today. Vince, where are you from? What are you doing?
Good morning, thank you. Well, obviously, I'm American, as you can tell from the accent. And second, you can tell I'm a tech company because I'm not wearing a necktie. But it's a European tech company. If we're an American tech company, I'd be wearing blue jeans and a T-shirt. I'm actually based in Prague. I run Avast. Avast is the world's second largest consumer-focused cybersecurity company. It's obviously Europe's largest. I actually, though, flew in from San Francisco. I was back in Napa Valley enjoying some good wine over the Thanksgiving holiday, so I just flew in last night. So if I nod off, my apologies. But Europe is actually a very dynamic region for cybersecurity companies, especially ones focused on the consumer market, much more diverse than the U.S. or Asia. And Avast these days is by far the largest. Avast is actually protecting about 40% of all the world's consumers outside of China. We always say outside of China because fundamentally non-Chinese security companies are not allowed to operate in China. So this one company based in Prague is protecting 40% of the world. And as such, we see a massive amount of data. We stop usually about 30 to 35 million attacks per month across our user base. So to scale that to global, you can just multiply it by 2.5. So it'd be about 75 million is what's happening per month across the internet. And we stop about 40% of those. Ransomware is obviously a hot topic right now, both businesses and consumers. Our data is a little bit different. For the first 10 months of the year, we saw a 105% increase in ransomware to about 20 million attacks. Now, what people should be worrying about on the internet, of course, is what do they have out there that's worth stealing? Because fundamentally, the entire business of cybercrime is basically about money. What do you have that is of value? So we look at several things. There's obviously cybercrime that people need to worry about. There's also legitimate use businesses. For example, Google, Facebook, WhatsApp, all these companies collect a tremendous amount of data, and most everyone trusts them to use the data responsibly. But those guys probably know more about you than anyone. Third is, of course, government. Government knows a heck of a lot about its citizens. They may not be as attuned to security as many businesses are, but there's a heck of a lot there that's valuable. But when we start looking at, what do people really get concerned about, it really varies around the world. For example, when we survey folks in many countries, what's your biggest concern about people getting access to your data? Many countries, it's of course cyber criminals. Some countries, it's government, but foreign governments, most everyone trusts their own government. Other countries are rather unique, like India. Anyone from India here? India, people's number one concern is their mother-in-law getting access to their data. Russia was number two, which is also rather interesting. But we all have a massive amount of data, and it's how do we protect it? And all of us, for the most part, believe that no one's doing a very good job of protecting it. For example, I think it's in the UK, a recent survey we did, only 40% of people thought that businesses did a good enough job protecting their personal data. Sounds pretty bad. But for government, it's almost exactly the same. I think it was 42% only think government did. And for the most part, people do not think it's the job of government to keep their personal data or to protect it. For the most part, they believe that their personal data is kept by businesses, mostly financial institutions, and that those are the ones that need to be protecting their data.
Thank you. Rastislav Janota from Slovakia. He's director of the Slovak National Security Authority. He works more on the government side as well, but your job is split between private and government as well. Tell us a bit about what you do.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. Yeah, I'm working for National Security Authority, but I'd like to represent here also the finishing Slovak presidency, which will hopefully end up next month. And maybe I'd like to talk more about this aspect than the security from my original job perspective. You know, between 2001 and 2011, ICT accounted 30% of GDP growth in Europe, while in the US it's 55%. This is quite a huge gap, and digital single market is one way how to close the gap. Of course, good implementation of digital single market has been estimated 415 billion euro income for Europe, which is huge. On the other side, we all know that digital world brings significant benefits, but also it's quite vulnerable. And this is what we are talking about here. What to do with it? Currently, trust in internet companies in Europe is quite low. Only 22% of individuals have full trust. 30% of firms are willing to do online transactions. We can see also 85% of internet users across Europe agree that risk becoming a victim of cybercrime and is increasing. According to different surveys, we see that cybersecurity and protection of data is very much key enabler for digital single market. Without improving trust into digital services, there are no way to do the digital single market implementation good and to gain the benefits from the digital single market. So discussion is how to improve trust, what to do in order to convince users that there are the way how to use digital technologies in a good way and in a way which will bring gain, which will bring benefit for them, for all the users, regardless if they are private or businesses.
Thank you, Stanislav. If you're tweeting today, the hashtag is hashtag TD2016, and please do so. We're talking a lot about trust already, and you're talking about values and your research. And I was reading last night about President Obama speaking at Stanford, and his message was really about the value system being within cybersecurity as well. He said that if we don't have our values embedded within it, if we don't protect the citizens within our cybersecurity element, we've lost something more than economic value. Tell us about your research, what you're doing on that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Actually, yeah, back to raise the trust among customers. When we are talking about cybersecurity and values, basically, it strikes me the fact that we need to have a deep understanding of what kind of values and what kind of European values and rights relate to cybersecurity at the first level. And what can we do with these values and which sort of values are important. Values, fundamental values like autonomy, like privacy, like fairness, freedom, responsibility, and accountability. And But to raise a trust among customers, we need to understand each other firstly. We as an involved stakeholder in cybersecurity market. So first of all, we need to understand each other, and one can simply observe a linguistic problem between different stakeholders who are involved in the market, including businesses, including customers, and including policymakers, and so on and so forth. So how we can cope with such a big problem, big challenge actually. So this is the bridging between different stakeholders, firstly. We need to bridge between different stakeholders, and I do believe that drawing attention on the common values of the stakeholders is the case. So if we listen to policymakers, if we listen to businesses, if we listen to customers, then we can reflect their interests and concerns into cybersecurity market, then we will be able to raise trust among partners, among customers. And so on top of that, so understanding each other help us to answer the questions of cyberspace. So we found in our project and our research by far, we found that digital single market has drawn on 4 dimensions. So first of all, cybersecurity needs to be inclusive in terms of values, inclusive in terms of values all stakeholders who are involved in cyberspace, and has to include voices in both trajectory of digitalization and in both goals. And also understand and recognize the diversity and complexity of values, because that's a critical point, because we are talking about different sorts of values. If we are talking about privacy from business perspective, it's going to be different from privacy from customer perspective. And so it's inclusiveness at the first level, it's mandatory. And that at the second level, the second dimension of, in order to be secured, while we are securing, including all values into the system, is that cybersecurity needs to also be anticipatory and reflexive to the values. So reflect to the right goals and reflect to the right pathways, and so on and so forth. So, and also it has to answer the question, what kind of future do we want? And what kind of future does cyberspace can bring with us which we cannot imagine? And the third level to be secure is transparency, which is really critical, especially at the private sector, at the security service provider, and so on and so forth. So this is really critical related to cybersecurity, being transparent and openness, and raise trust among customers, among all partners, but it's really critical to implement it in practice. And and the fourth level is a kind of commitment to openness and commitment to transparency. And the fourth level, the last level, is that so all of those is possible, but all of those possible when we are responsive as a business, as a customers, as a security service provider. So responsiveness as a different level, as a systematic level, and as also as an institution. And to example of that, we have security service providers who are investigating malware, who are investigating malicious, and they are investigating a malware, but at the same time, they also need to be part of the system to secure the system, to secure the networks, like botnets. And if you are part of the system, they are also a bad guy, because you are fighting against bad guy, but you will be a bad guy in the system in order to detect the malware and malicious, and it hurts some innocent users. So these are the 4 dimensions that we found that we can work on that in order to be secured. While we are securing, we also include voices. But the point is that here, this is the bigger picture that we can discuss about today. What is described as meta-governance of cybersecurity, particularly in businesses? Yeah.
Udo, what are we doing at the European level? What is the structure in terms of cooperation, in terms of protocols, and having a systemic response?
Let me give you just a short reflection and then coming to this. I think one thing is evident that we are going to digitize everything in the end. So this is something what we saw this morning, where we have disruptive business models, people going there. And I just want to mention that we are also aware of this. With everything on this, we go with challenges, and then the question, what does legislation do? So I want to pick one point because it's important for me, and then I also make an example on European level. It's about, you mentioned, how do we deal with our data, privacy? And there's an interesting evolution. When you look in the past, and when I come from Germany, it was a country which has a strong belief in, let's say, minimum disclosure of data, having a tough regulation. And you see that approaches of digitizing our society, digital single market, also the terms change. And now in Germany, we don't discuss anymore data security, we now discuss data sovereignty. And if you look to the politicians, what they mean by this is, that means monetizing data, having new business model with data. The other discussion, if you talk about data, is then that you have discussion with security versus safety in the discussion of terrorism, where we have, again, starting the discussion about weakening encryption, putting backdoors in, where we from ENISA fighting really strong against it. And when you now look what kind of legislation is done on a European level, then you see that we try to do a couple of things. With the EIDAS directive, we want to put trust into business models. We want to have trust centers, electronic signatures, encryption used, that you can really be sure that your identity is protected or that data is protected in the end. If we go to the NIS directive, it's about governance structure, that we have national security agencies like we have here in Slovakia or in Germany or France, that we have ministries responsible. We are talking about incident reporting. We have it in the telecommunications sector. We want to have it also in all critical infrastructure sectors. And then we want to have this third community in the CSIRT network where we have the secretary to communicate better on incident response. So the question for the future is then, in what cases you need additional legislation to protect what or to enforce what? This is a discussion which was also mentioned a bit by Commissioner Oettinger this morning.
Okay, thank you. Vince, how much of a role does government really play in cybersecurity? Does it matter as much as people think it does, or is this really market-driven? Is the response to markets, cybersecurity going to be a market-driven response?
Well, maybe I get in trouble for answering this, but I think it matters in Brussels, Washington, D.C., and London, and that's probably about it. For the most part, I mean, the fox is already in the chicken coop. We're talking about legislating something that's already there. Just because there's some new legislation or some laws on data privacy isn't going to make you trust Google or Amazon or Alibaba or Alza.cz or any place else that you do business. The world is heavily online. Most of us do, we have just about our entire life online. And we fundamentally trust those that we are dealing with right now. And most of us fundamentally trust our government. And as the government moves towards putting more services online, you're going to, in most of the world, we're going to trust it. And, institutions, I think, already, if an institution is already trusted, that trust is going to transfer to the cyber relationship. And now, of course, the trust could be lost. But I don't think legislation causes trust to be gained. And a lot of what we see around the world with legislation in cybersecurity or security data privacy is frankly protectionism in another name. Now for ourselves, we actually operate all of our data centers in Europe just so that we don't have to deal with laws anywhere else. But when you look at what, say, Russia's done with LinkedIn and what Brazil's done with Google, or what the EU's been trying to do with some of the American companies, most of it is really protectionism. It's not additional privacy, it's not additional security. So I think we always got to look at how does it affect the average person? And I think as Brexit and Trump has showed us, those of us who are kind of elites, we don't really know what the average people are thinking and what their problems are and what they trust and what they don't trust. And we got to realize there's a lot more to the world than the folks in Brussels, DC, and London.
Let me bring this into the digital market context now. If we lose trust in the government capacity to protect us, even if it isn't actually doing that, and if we lose trust in large companies who hold most of our data, what happens to the single market, digital single market?
Maybe let's start with the fact that if somebody is relying on the government, that the government will protect own data, it doesn't work. At the end, everyone should protect own data on its own. So there is no other way. Government could prepare a proper policy environment. Government, even on the technical side, government could help with some particular roles and tasks, but at the end, the owner of the data is responsible for the data itself. And the trust is not built by, let's say, magic word from the government side. Now, there, everything is good. Everyone believes that there will be no other crime or whatever cyber incident available because we adopted the law. It doesn't work like that. Unfortunately, it seems to me that there is still a huge amount of citizens, companies, who believes that the government will protect them, and if something went wrong, then they point to government that you didn't do enough protection for our data. No, this is not the way. On the other side, the government is responsible for, let's say, teaching or doing the marketing of the cybersecurity topic to really speak about the issue, to describe what should be done and what could be done, and to convince all the users, regardless if they are from the private side or consumer side and even government side, that they must do something on their own. And if they need help, then maybe ask for help, but not rely on somebody else. If I protect my own house, I am not relying on anybody's help. I have my own doors, my own, let's say, fences, for instance, etc. And if something gets wrong, maybe I didn't do correct preparation for the situation.
Okay, let's take some questions from the floor. We have a couple of microphones about somewhere. Okay, here first. Let's take two questions together. Another question? Okay, just tell us, sorry, Dorian.
She's going to get the microphone.
Okay, we'll get your microphone in just a second. Hold on now. Okay. It seems to me the government operates more like an invisible hand in this, that we have the big brand names, Avast being one. Gentleman here, Dorian. But do you think, Vince, just while we get the microphone here, do you think that brand names are going to be, consumer brand names for cybersecurity are going to be the go-to, and or do you think that actually, in the end, government actually will come up with a response that people can depend on?
Well, I think people rely on government and trust government for national defense, but they don't have a connection between government and defending their own private and personal data. Most people see that as their responsibility.
When we see large-scale hacks?
No, I don't think it will change at all because, for example, in the U.S., it's pick on target markets. You know, Target, it's a big retailer. They got hacked. Their credit cards got hacked. There's got no connection with the government. People don't expect the government to have anything at all to do with that. So I think for the most part, consumers trust in brands, trust in brand names. They trust in Avast, they trust in Semantic. Frankly, they trust in Google. They trust in Microsoft. There's a set of companies that they trust in that, hey, I will give you my data, but I trust you're going to do the right thing with it. Or Semantic or Avast, I trust that you're going to protect my computer. They just don't associate that governments are going to protect their computer or their engagement online.
Tell us who you are and where you're from, please, as well.
My name is Cornelius Eich. I'm working for the German Electronic Industry Association, ZVI. I have a question for Mr. Helmbrecht, actually. The Commission has recently announced to look into the ENISA to evaluate and review the ENISA as a structure, as an agency. And I would like to know whether, to what extent actually ENISA will change in the near future. Also in terms of the other players on the field, namely EXO, and there's also the new cybersecurity PPP in charge. So I would like to know whether ENISA will change or not. Thank you.
That is like looking into the crystal ball. There's a process behind it. We currently have a legislation which is in place until mid-2020. So the Commission will come up with a proposal end of next year. It's in the Commission working program. The process is that we will put in our ideas, the Commission ideas. We will have the evaluation, which is running now, the impact assessment. Then when the Commission has published it, it's not put even in stone, then it goes to the Parliament, to the Council. So this means it takes roughly 1.5 years. At least I think what should be done, from my perspective, just a couple of remarks, is first, we are an agency who has 11 million euros and 84 posts. The question is, what shall an agency like this do on a European level? We are currently, as I say, mostly in the preventive area. So the question is, how operational should an agency become from its task? If you look into our regulation, we have a lot what I call something like a teethless tiger. It says, on request of the member states, it says should, could, it doesn't say shall. So the question is, how much would member states give to a European agency? This is the discussion. Of course, if you ask us, we want to do more, but in the end, it's the decision of the member states. Another point is what I think is missing today in the discussion, that if you look from a European level, what you saw this morning in the first panel and here, it's still a scattered environment. With the NIS directive, we do a bit, but it's, let's say, more reactive to what we have seen in the past. If you look to the future, the question is, what is a European governance structure? Yeah? You have a couple of agencies who deal with IT. You have European defense agencies. You have BEREC. You have the Europol Cybercrime Center. So I think what I would like to see from the Commission also is a vision. How do we see beyond the digital single market? How do we see the IT security landscape in Europe, and who is responsible for what? And I think if you dig into it, you have a couple of things which are still in national sovereignty, because if you look into our business, it covers cybercrime. We don't deal with espionage on a European level. We don't deal with asymmetric warfare on European level. So, but in the end, it's the same technology, the same threat vectors. So somehow you have to deal in the future in another way than you deal with it today.
It would seem to me that you mentioned 450 billion cybercrime being the new battlefront earlier on, that your budget is a little less than it should be to take on such a vast enterprise out there. Do you think that protecting Europe's economy really requires a much stronger investment and a more cohesive approach?
I don't like to answer the way in this way, because if you talk about the mandate, it's a big chance for the Commission to think, how do you want to organize it in the future? And the question from a European level is, what do you want to do on a member state, and what do you want to do on a European level? And just to give you a simple example, in Greece, where our agency is located, the government just reshuffled the portfolios, and they have now a ministry dedicated for the digital portfolio. They have a Secretary General dealing with networks, infrastructure, and they have a Secretary General who dealing with e-government. So this is something where Greece tries to concentrate this in a ministry. If you look, we only have a few member states who really have national agencies dealing with IT security. You have the big ones. Then you have member states who have a mature industry in IT security, and then you have member states which joined the Union 8 years ago, who still need support on a European level. So if you look into information exchange, it was mentioned information exchange is based on trust. We don't have an IT security information exchange in the third network like it's in, let's say, should be in the future. There's a long way to go. So I think the challenge is then that you have to discuss how do you structure this from the NIS directive governance structure when it's implemented on the member states level, on a European level, and what responsibility do you give an agency on European level? And then the question is, how do you deal on commissioner levels with this? If you look today, you have the Commissioner King, who is talking about safety, security, IT security. You have Mr. Ansip, who talking about this. You have Commissioner Oettinger talking about this. So the question is, if you have an incident in Europe from the crisis management perspective, which commissioner or director general do you call out of bed at midnight? This is not known today. Yeah? So this means I could give you my ideas, but I'm talking more about that this is a big chance for the member states and the Commission to really find something. How do you want to deal with IT security beyond the digital single market, and then think about what you put into the ENISA regulation and what you regulate in another way?
Okay. And to this point, I guess, so we can talk about also kind of because we are talking about kind of the normative orientation to cybersecurity in different stakeholders, right? If we have a kind of the right things for all of the stakeholders, then we can have a kind of agreement on that from European perspective, from international perspective, and then work on that. So my point is that maybe to this point, we need to define the right things from the European scale, but we cannot assume that we cannot assumption to make it across the board. So it's just from European perspective, from European scale, because maybe it's not fit to what's happening in the other part of the world. They are doing also some wonderful pieces of cybersecurity, especially at the technical level. But we need to find a solution for the right things and this normative orientation as a bigger picture for cybersecurity, and it should be some things as a process in forms, as a kind of raise awareness in the European scale first, and then it's not something that we can assume is the right things just from the European scale, and that's it.
But do you think that leads to some type of, to put it bluntly, a bill of rights for consumers, and that should codify what the values are? Okay. Let me bring, Vince has been with Avast for 8 years, is that right?
8 years.
And tell us a bit about the background. What size was the company then? What size is it now?
Well, Avast, when I took it over in January of 2009, we were about 40 people. We were doing maybe $17 million of business. I apologize for using dollars. We actually run the company on the dollar because the Czech Republic's not part of the Eurozone. So according to accounting regulations, we had to use the dollar. So we were quite small. These days, we're about 2,000 people and about $800 million in business. So we've grown hugely over the last 8 years, focused on cybersecurity.
Market. Would you have expected that? Would you have expected that level of skill that quickly?
Absolutely. That's why I took it over. It was I mean, Avast is probably the world's oldest cybersecurity company. It started in the closing days of communism in 1988 as a cooperative, when a couple of researchers in a university got hit with one of the first viruses, and they built a product to fix it and started a cooperative. And then it existed as just a very little regional company for many, many years, and then broke internationally in the early 2000s, and then, of course, exploded over the last 4 or 5 years. And I think it's one of those few real, from the ground up, success stories in IT in Europe. It's great to see it.
We spoke a little bit earlier before we come on just about how people perceive different threats. For a lot of people, they would think that if their health insurance records were attacked, that would be a big deal. Do you see the market that way? Do you see things as the consumer sees them?
I mean, It's really what is the value of the information. So if you ignore government-sponsored espionage and you ignore your mother-in-law or your spouse, the data the bad guys want, cyber criminals want, is data that they can easily monetize. That's personal information, it's credit cards, it's ID numbers, etc. It's very difficult to monetize health data. I mean, there's not a gray market out there to sell someone's health data. What are they going to do? You know, send you advertisements for medicines? Possibly, you know, on high-profile individuals, blackmail. But otherwise, health data, although it's very sensitive, it's not valuable. It's for the most part not worth stealing. That doesn't mean you shouldn't protect it.
Well, this is only one side of the medal. The question is, if you talk about data, of course, can you monetize it? I completely agree. But there's another question for the future. If somebody is born today and you have a life expectation more than 100 years, then the question is, how is dealt with the data in 100 years? Nobody knows it. Yeah? So, but at least for the next 15, 20 years, even for us, how is with our data dealt? And I give you another example, which is for me, let's say, worrying in the sense that we don't have an idea how do we want to deal with this. Today, we have insurances who give you a discount if you disclose your medical data. So you have people who have fitness tracker disclose their fitness data. And on one side, you say, okay, if you disclose all this medical data, you put it somewhere, it can be used for research, to have better, let's say, medicine in the future. But on the other hand, maybe in 10 years, you ask for a job, and then your employer says, oh, sorry, with this genes and with this health record, we won't take you. Or you go to the health insurance and say, oh, you have to pay double the health insurance. So the question is that we don't know what happens with the data in the future. So monetizing is one side, but the other thing is that there might be in our society another way that we lose the control of our, let's say, personal individual. And then the question is, how do we deal with this when other people control our data?
Rastislav, your agency, how does that sense of what happens in the future dictate what you're doing now in terms of the evolution of your work?
It's pretty general question, to be frank. Maybe I'd like to talk more about the cyber part of my job. I did a couple of months ago small research on the world we see right now, or it was a couple of months ago, about 36 war conflicts around the world, every single one with a cyber aspect somewhere in it. From use of social networks to hacking, or really proactive attack towards specific target. So this part of the cyber life, it's quite clear. This is, you mentioned correctly, this is part where citizens expect the government would take care. The other side, economic impact of cyber life and privacy impact of cyber life is not so regulated. On the privacy side, the regulation framework is pretty important. We see a lot of problems with the multinational corporations, with the way how they deal with data, with the way how they sell behavioral data to the marketing agencies or to target marketing through the personal use, through the personal data. So this is, for me, it's risky. For me, it's kind of big brother approach, which is, as the citizen view, not good. On the other side, I don't see easy way how to get out of it. This is currently it's a huge economy to use of data, and monetizing different type of data is moving part of the business quite fast forward. So it wouldn't be easy to find a correct answer about the balance. We can see comparison between the US and Europe in terms of privacy. On the Europe side, that privacy is mantra. Everything is on the second level, privacy is on the first level, always. US, completely different approach. Question, what is better? What will help us with the future challenges? Again, there is no single answer. Depends on situation, and probably, as usual, the truth is somewhere between. But it would take some time to write the fine balance.
Just a moment, Vince, you want to reply?
Yeah, I've got to disagree on that, number one. Number two, about privacy. In that, I don't, as an American and the head of a European company, I don't really see any meaningful difference around the world. Maybe at the policymaker level, Europeans take privacy. But at the consumer level, I don't think consumers are any different. For example, how many people here use WhatsApp? Yeah. Okay, did you ask, for all of you who use WhatsApp, did you ask all of your contacts if it was okay if you shared their personal information with WhatsApp and Facebook? No. How many people use Google? Okay, so you've shared all of your personal data with Google so they can serve you advertisements. How many people use Facebook? You've shared all your personal information. We all do this. It's a trade-off of how much we're giving up versus the convenience we're getting back. And as we look around the world, there's no difference between Germans, Brits, Americans, Brazilians, Russians at the consumer level as far as their willingness to trade off personal data for convenience. Everyone does it.
Okay. Yes, go ahead.
You are right, but I think it's a bit too easy to look at this in this way. I give you another example. When you look into, let's say, our daily life, I go into a restaurant. Of course, I expect that this restaurant obeys a couple of standards. And if I, let's say, in Europe, in a civilized country, then I know that there's a supervision. And if this, and of course, I can have bad food, but on a regular basis, I know that there are inspections, that there are standards, regulation, and I trust that when I go into a restaurant, I don't die after eating. So, if you look in our business, it's Wild West. Okay, you can say the consumer wants a Wild West, but the consumer only wants a Wild West until the consumer is not harmed in the end. So, we have no liability. We have no software liability. We don't have certification schemes like in other areas. So the question for me is, when you look into the evolution of other sectors like cars, trains, airplanes, food, healthcare, and wherever, we regulate it. And regulate it more in some states than in others. And the question is, what do we want to have in the cyberspace in the future?
We're pretty close to time, so let's take these two questions and these bills. Let's take them together. So, you got a microphone here, please? Just at the front. Thank you. Just tell us who you are, where you're from, please.
Hi, I'm Raymond Huner from LinkedIn, and I've got a question regarding regulation, like you were just saying that you want to enforce that and kind of regulate these things. But how would you actually follow up with it, right? How would you, if something happens, like the cell phone of Angela Merkel gets tapped, right? What happens, right? Clearly this was not allowed. Then you have the Patriot Act from the Americans, and we have our own legislation in Europe. But nobody's governing at that level, right? I mean, within Europe, we're trying to regulate things. Within the US, we regulate things. The Patriot Act allows a lot of things happening in Europe. We disagree with it. So what's your perspective on this? It's not a particular question, maybe for who wants to take it?
So one person take this question. Who wants it? Vince.
Vince. Golly. Patriot Act. I usually tell people that if a government wants to spy on you, there's nothing you can do to stop them, regardless of whether they have regulations or not regulations. And when we look at people around the world, they are, for the most part, not concerned about their own government spying on them. Russians aren't concerned about Russia spying on them. Chinese aren't concerned about China spying on them. It's like that around the world. There's a fundamental trust in the government. I think there's a larger issue in that, especially on the internet, is that the whole reason we have all the discussions, privacy, protection, data, et cetera, is that the internet is fundamentally advertising sponsored. And it's the fact that the whole internet infrastructure is supported by advertising. It's what's given rise to all of this discussions on data, et cetera, data privacy. But it's a balancing act. The more you want to constrain businesses on what they can do with data, the less they can do on the internet for you because advertising pays for it. On the government side, they can end up fundamentally doing what they want. There's nothing we can do about it.
Thank you. The last question here.
Gabriela Doina, College of Europe. My question concerns potential solutions for increasing trust in the cybersphere. So the first one is open source software. Do you think that open source software could decrease cyber hacking, given that it allows users to customize software, therefore decreasing the incentives to hack? And also another solution, labeling. Do you think that potentially labeling companies as cyber safe could also again decrease incentives to hack and increase cyber trust?
Okay, Rastislav.
Just short notice, the cyber incidents, cyber problems, 80% reason is between the keyboard and the chair, not the computer. So, and no solution, no software, no product will make us much safer. We must educate users first. So discussion about if we will implement specific product, okay, it might help to some extent. As long as you have educated user, it will have more. If the user is not educated, it will have less.
Thank you. We're going to stick to our schedule here, so we're going to sum up quickly. We spoke of 3 animals this morning, you may have noticed, foxes, chickens, and tigers. So I think you're responsible for... Yeah, you got it. So the fox is already in the chicken coop, that the legislation is something of a toothless tiger. And also we should be aiming something which should approximate a Bill of Rights, which can give that sense of trust. And I think it was clear from the first part of the discussion, without trust, the digital single market doesn't work. Business will not grow. And we're looking at a growth industry of $450 billion on the new battlefield of cyber attacks, cyber hacking, and all the benefits there. So whether you want to get into the market of protecting against that or actually exploiting it one way or the other, there's market opportunity there. The government can do what it wants, and whether the legislation is in place or not, the shape and nature of the regime tells us that we should vote perhaps more carefully than ever these days. So any further comment on that? And let me just thank our panelists today. Emad Yaghmaei, from the research fellow at the Delft University of Technology, Rastislav Janota, Director of Slovak National Security Authority, Udo Helmbrecht, Executive Director at ENISA, and Vincent Steckler, Global CEO of Avast. Thank you to all of you. Thank you for your participation today.